This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. We have very special guests. Benjamin Lessing, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's on the line. And we're going to be discussing this week organized crime in the Americas, focusing obviously on the key regions, the key countries, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, but also dipping into Venezuela, Ecuador, El Salvador, and anywhere else that is pertinent to this conversation. So, yes, Benjamin, thank you so much for coming on the LatinNews Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Your most recent book that will be coming out in 2026, Criminal Leviathans, How Gangs Govern from Behind Bars. Well, I've had an opportunity to look at some of the chapters or a part of the chapters, and it's very interesting indeed. And of course, I think we should probably start by saying, look at the facts around and surrounding criminal gangs and criminal organizations within Latin America. I read, researching for this, that between 77 and 101 million people are living with some sort of criminal governance. And that means 1 in 9 in Latin America. Does this sound right?
Yeah, that's a figure that my colleagues and I came up with. It's an estimate. It's obviously a very imprecise estimate. 77 to 101 million is already pretty imprecise, but it's based off of survey data that was that came out in 2020 from Latin Barometer, which is a region-wide opinion survey that's done every year. And they asked people this year, or in 2020, they asked people, among many, many other questions, they asked, is there a criminal gang or organization where you live? And then if you said yes, they asked what that organization did, and they gave you some options. And among the options were that criminal organization provides order or improves safety or reduces crime. And so if you said any of those things, we counted that as living with criminal governance. And yeah, those are the figures. A lot of people said that there was a gang that provided order or reduced or increased security where they live. And I think a lot more than anything, that figure calls for more research. It calls for those kinds of questions being included in more surveys. It's a beginning, not an end, but it just gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. We detected at least 5 to 6% of the population reporting criminal governance in every country, even in countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Costa Rica, countries that were sort of previously thought of as Chile, countries thought of as not having these kind of problems. And in many countries, rates, in double digits, including countries like Costa Rica and Ecuador, which, sort of at first surprised us, but then with recent events doesn't really surprise us anymore, as we've seen organized crime in those countries getting more organized, getting more powerful. And then going all the way up to Brazil, where 1 in 4 people said that there was a criminal organization, making them safer or providing order where they lived, which is part of what's driving that huge region-wide number. Is Brazil is the largest country in Latin America, and it's got the highest rate of criminal governance. So that's just sort of 50 million people in Brazil alone by that estimate.
Is it staggering numbers, but not something that surprises me, obviously, as a long-time resident here. I think very interesting that you said 5 to 6%. And of course, you mentioned Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile, places that we don't ordinarily consider as places, as countries suffering from organized crime. But these are subjects and topics that we've addressed on this podcast. And of course, we talked about the issues of organized crime in Costa Rica, that was now a trafficking country, and of course, political corruption there, and Uruguay being a major transshipment place, a location for cocaine to Europe. I believe Chile with the Tren de Aragua as well. To what can you attribute this increase? I mean, do we look at the policies or the state policies of trying to combat with repressive measures? Is this also increasing the organized crime and their power? How do we explain this growth, I would say?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think you want to situate a little bit what we're talking about here. The numbers we were just discussing are about criminal governance over civilians. And there's a lot of organized crime, there's a lot of crime and organized crime that isn't about governing civilians, right? There's a lot going on in the world. People are trafficking organs, and people are trafficking human beings, and people are doing all kinds of, and there's all kinds of illicit contracting with governments. We think about the world of the universe of organized crime, of course, and then there's the international drug trade. And, think about that giant sort of circle, and then criminal governance overlaps with that circle, but it's not the same thing, right? So we want to make sure we're talking about, sort of what we're talking about. And not all, even many powerful organized crime groups, may not really be in the business of governing civilians, or they may govern, some mafia groups in New York City might govern their little neighborhood or something like that, but they're not really in the business of taking over favelas and governing, millions of people in the urban peripheries of slums and stuff like that. Even in Mexico, the big cartels in Mexico, their approach to criminal governance seems a little different than what we see in Brazil or places like Medellin, Colombia, or El Salvador, or Central America in general, right? The big international cartels, they're trying to get drugs across the border. They're not necessarily trying to govern millions of people living in urban slums. Organized criminal organizations need a reason to govern civilians because it's costly. It gets them involved in all kinds of things. So why do criminal organizations govern civilians? Well, it's often because they are, in one way or another, sort of from those neighborhoods, or have some connection to that neighborhood, or are trying to kind of monopolize or aggregate up local retail drug trading across a lot of neighborhoods, across urban peripheries within a given context. Or in the case of the Maras in El Salvador and the rest of Central America, they were operating with extortion, right? So they didn't really have access to retail drug markets, but they were knitting together, these extortion networks that were, it started off as very small gangs in many, many different communities. And then these Mara groups were able to kind of aggregate them together into larger criminal structures. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there's a kind of form of organized crime that I think hasn't really drawn as much attention as the big flashy international drug cartels or the big mafias who get involved in, sacking government contracts and things like that, which are these, I think of them as kind of bottom-up criminal organizations that are able to sort of bring together or organize little tiny street crews from different neighborhoods into larger structures. And so we see that take different forms. Like I just said, the Maras of Central America, they, from prison, built up these organizations that were made up of little cliques in different neighborhoods throughout, these countries, but that, they were able to kind of aggregate them up together into much larger and more sophisticated organizations based out of prison. If you look at Medellin, Colombia, as a different model, but it's structurally very similar. You've got these little combos in every neighborhood in Medellin, and over the decades, they've been organized into larger structures. Now, those structures aren't prison gangs. They were Don Berna and militias from the Civil War coming in and organizing these little street gangs into groups that were, in a sense, fighting, initially sort of fighting the Civil War. And then in the last 10 or 15 years with the demobilizations, they stayed on. They still exist there. And those are these groups that the Paz Total peace process is dealing with, these very structured groups that, that control, they control crime in all these neighborhoods around Medellin. And we see similar structures now sprouting up in other places. I think that's what we're seeing in Ecuador. Well, before I get to Ecuador, I should just say, and Brazil is the kind of granddaddy of them all. Brazil has had these prison-based organizations now in Rio de Janeiro, going back almost 50 years to the 1970s and late 70s, early 80s, when the Comando Vermelho, sort of does this for the first time, right? It starts off in prison. It grows, it spreads through the prison system, and then it begins spreading out into the favelas and bringing together organizations, local gangs and local drug trafficking organizations in different favelas, and tying them together into this sort of networked prison-based structure, which is the Comando Vermelho. And then, from there it spread. It spread to São Paulo with the Primeiro Comando da Capital. And then in the last 10 years, it's really spread across the whole country. So Brazil today is a country where almost anywhere you go, any big city, and you go to, favela neighborhoods, those neighborhoods are almost always sort of within that neighborhood, there won't be lots of tiny little gangs. They'll just be, everybody will be one faction or another faction. It will be Comando Vermelho, or it'll be PCC, or it'll be a local faction, and that faction will be controlled from prison. And that faction will control multiple favela neighborhoods in that city, whatever state it may be in. So that model of sort of, I sometimes think of it as sort of bottom-up organized crime, or that model of organizing street crews into these larger structures. Brazil's has sort of taken it to the max, where that's the way the entire country is structured. I think what you're seeing in places like Ecuador, and maybe even Uruguay, Chile, and these places with lower levels where it's incipient, is I think you're seeing that model sort of starting to come together, starting to begin to happen, where some kind of criminal organization is realizing it can bring together these street crews in lots of different neighborhoods, exert territorial control, and get something out of it, whether that be extort the local population, or whether that be running local drug retailing, or but they find some angle where it's worth their while to kind of control peripheral neighborhoods and bring the local criminal, sometimes they're not even criminal, they're just small little gangs, but to bring them together, and in that way have territorial control across a city or even a country.
So in Ecuador's case, obviously, I guess it was January last year when it was made all the headlines, and of course has dropped off with the increase of violence in the country, and the gang Los Choneros, obviously organized out of prison as well, if I'm not mistaken. So that Brazilian model has been successfully exported across the region, and much in the news at the moment, the Tren de Aragua from Venezuela, which I believe had its initial stages in the Tocorón prison in Venezuela as well. So how do the authorities even address the situation of this, let's say, bottom-up criminal organizations that then become controlled from prisons?
I mean, I don't think authorities, address it very well. I think, so what I'm sort of trying to argue in my new book is that this process, there's sort of two aspects to it, and both of the aspects, and again, really looking at Brazil as a model. So maybe other countries kind of approximate that model. So if you're listening in and you're from Ecuador, you say it doesn't quite match up with what Ben is saying. Well, maybe it's, again, I think of the Brazil case as very extreme, but it's very illustrative, even if other cases don't 100% match up with it. But what you had in Brazil, over and over again, first in Rio, then in São Paulo, then across the country, is these prison-based organizations, again, reaching into neighborhoods. And in those neighborhoods, in the status quo ante, you've got a lot of skirmishes between small gangs, small little groups. Maybe they're running a local drug retailing and they're fighting over turf. Maybe they're just local gangs. It's kind of anomic, violence with kids with nothing really left to lose or whatever. When the prison gangs come in and start organizing, and they by community, they're like, okay, everyone in this community, we're all Comando Vermelho. And you have to, whatever your beef with the other guy, whatever your revenge thing, whatever who's killing who, it's over. And in that process of agglutinating the local gangs together with it and unifying that territory, it has a pacifying quality, right? It often brings local pacification to favela neighborhoods, even if between neighborhoods, even if the gangs now you've got 3 or 4 big gangs and they're fighting for the whole city, and so now you've got invasions and things are getting kind of more violent. You've got now a level of inter-gang war that can be extremely violent. They've got a lot more, they're able to concentrate force, and so you get spectacular violence or now they're able to do the kind of orchestrated prison attacks that you mentioned in Ecuador, right? Now they've got enough people on the street that they can burn a bunch of buses or whatever, cause chaos. So the violence can get more extreme and concentrated, but within each community, they sort of, they create a single organization where there used to be many. And so that creates a kind of local pacification. That's kind of step one. That once they've got that, new level of organization, they are able to streamline their criminal activity, right? So they can make the retail drug trade much more effective. They've got centralized supply. They might have a centralized sort of, packaging or whatever. And they monopolize that neighborhood. So like one organization now controls all of the retail points of sale in that neighborhood. It's more profitable. They're able to sell more because it's safer, right? The neighborhood's now safe. There's not a bunch of gangs fighting. So customers feel better about going there. And then I think kicks in the next phase of this criminal governance dynamic, which is, and this is, I think, particularly true of drug retail, right? I think with contexts where the local gang is living off of extortion, maybe there's no drug profits, or for whatever reason, the retail drug trade isn't a factor. What I'm about to say is less salient. But when that's your business, when your business is selling, retail drugs on street corner, it suddenly you start there's a kind of logic that kicks in of like, well, we should make this place safe. We don't want people calling the police for their day-to-day problems. So let's us start solving people's problems for them, because we don't want them to go to the police. So we'll do dispute resolution. We'll recover their stolen, somebody steals something. We'll make sure they get it back. We'll become the local authority. And then I think another logic kicks in, which is, all right, so now we've kind of, the favela is safe. Nobody's pickpocketing. Nobody's robbing in the neighborhood. No one's calling the cops. But the cops are coming in anyway because they're fighting a drug war, right? The cops like to come in and bust whatever. Whether they're coming in to bust us or to shake us down for bribes, they like to come in. And so we need to have a defensive posture. Even if we stop everybody from calling the cops are going to come in. So what are we going to happen then? We need residents to help us, to be willing to help us when the cops come in. And that means we need residents to feel loyal to us, right? And so then you get this logic, and this kind of began with the Comando Vermelho, but I think it's developed since then. I'm not just going to govern here. I'm not just going to, prohibit, tell people they can't call the cops or even prohibit street crime. I'm going to actually try to win people's loyalty. I'm not saying this happens all the time or that the drug gangs are wonderful people or anything like that. I don't want to paint overly rosy picture, but there's definitely evidence that gangs understand the need to win over residents. And so they make efforts to do so. That can be welfare provision, right? It can be throwing parties, helping out the poorest of the people. It can be providing entertainment. It can be listening, right? And actually kind of trying to be a good authority figure and hear their complaints and be flexible and things like that. Again, not saying it happens all the time, but there's this incentive to not just govern the periphery, but to govern it well, because you're trying to win the loyalty. You want these people, when the cops come in, to say, all right, between the cops and the gang, we prefer the gang, because at least the gang listens to us. Okay, at least the gang doesn't, isn't violent against us or discriminates against us or whatever. They understand us, or they're, So once that's in place, the gangs are providing pretty thoroughgoing governance. And again, I don't want to overestimate it. I don't want to say favelas aren't dangerous places, but it's a pretty well-known fact, and you and I were just talking about this, that in many favela communities in Brazil, it's actually pretty safe. There's violence when there's a police invasion. There's violence when one gang tries to invade another. But on a day-to-day basis, there's not a lot of property crime. Nobody's pickpocketing anybody. The gangs are adamant about sexual violence, right? So they find and punish and lynch, rapists and pedophiles and things like that. And quite often the gangs are, you see these communities. Again, there's huge variation, right? But some favela communities are quite vibrant economically, right? They have bustling streets with stuff going on, and it's actually a pretty safe environment. And so there's these street sellers selling things, and a lot of people live there. And so once that's happening, right? And you said, this is going back to your question about what does the state do about this? My feeling, my finding, one of my core findings in this book is that once this governance is in place, once these gangs have started doing this, and they're doing it in response to state repression. They're doing it because the state is coming in and busting their drug points of sale. They're doing it because they want people to not call the cops, right? They're doing it to keep some area free of the state because the state is threatening to come in. So that's why they do it in the first place. But once they do it, once they establish this kind of criminal governance, the state rarely actually says, hey, wait, no, you can't govern here. That's our job. We're the state. Get out of here. We're going to be in charge. We're going to set up shop here and make sure that residents know that the state is has a kind of a monopoly on the legitimate use of force or whatever. The state rarely does that, but it mostly just keeps doing what it was doing. It just mostly keeps fighting the drug war, arresting people, building mass incarceration, building new prisons, increasing the incarceration rate, trying to get longer sentences, harshening sentences. But it rarely does it say, we need to stop these gangs from governing civilians. That's a red line for us. In fact, it isn't a red line for most governments. And it ends up being, in my argument, actually something that the state benefits from. So the state's going to keep fighting crime. It's going to keep locking people up. It's going to keep capturing kingpins or doing big busts. And okay, we caught all these drugs, and but they sort of conspicuously don't occupy on a permanent basis and provide thoroughgoing governance in these communities. They let the gangs continue to do that. And my argument is because it saves money, it saves resources. It's a good deal for the state, right? Now you've got your urban periphery being pretty well governed by some criminal organization, and you don't have to do it yourself. They're doing a better job than you would have done.
So the government and the state can focus on the big, let's say, optics. You catch a major drug runner, capo, etc. But as you say, on the low level, on these barrios, favelas, comunas, whatever, that have always been stigmatized as being lawless places and have, I would say, little state interest in them. Therefore, it's of use to the state to have these criminal gangs in there. So, I mean, I recall I was living in Brazil in, I think it was 2006, when there was a huge amount of incursions into the favelas. And the people knew when it was going to come because the helicopters would hover over them. The upset and the violence, resulting from this. But as you mentioned earlier, the state doesn't then occupy. It then retires back to its region. So, they'll go in, but they'll go out again. And this doesn't, as I was sort of saying, there's nothing. It's optics at the end of it. It doesn't change a situation within these areas. And what I found incredibly interesting in the text that I read that you sent me, of course, is you state that these are misguided state policies, trying to do mass incarceration and repression, because these then strengthen the criminal groups that they're aiming to contain. So can we talk about any possibilities that where the state has tried to do this and it may have been, can we see, I mean, I think the easiest place to look at is El Salvador in this moment. Obviously the Bukele model that everybody, so many sort of, I would say, strong on law and order candidates or potential candidates, especially here in Colombia or elsewhere in Ecuador. I know, they always talk about the Bukele model. Let's lock everybody up. But what I have to ask you this as an expert, what's going to happen in the Bukele model? They've got everyone jailed, or a huge percentage of the, let's say, young men are jailed. In I don't know how many years, are they going to let these people out? I mean, I couldn't even hazard a guess. But give us some of your feelings about this.
Sure, yeah. So, well, I think the short answer is we don't know what's going to happen in El Salvador, right? We don't know. It raises a lot of questions. But let's take a step back, because I think people, people have heard about the Bukele model. It's in the news. Like now with Trump, I mean, sending deportees there, so it's kind of hit the big time. And but I think you really need to take a step back in two senses to make sense of what's happening in El Salvador. The first is just what you mentioned very briefly, is this idea that many forms of state repression or crackdowns or mano dura have, at least historically, ended up strengthening gangs. I think that's a really important thing to realize. And it's something that I talk about at length in this book project. I try to kind of catalog all these different mechanisms by which state repression and crackdowns can strengthen gangs. And there's many mechanisms. There's not just one mechanism, right? There's lots of different ways that this happens. And it's not, and I also don't want to claim that that's the only thing that state repression does. When the state comes in and they, extradite El Chapo, that hurts the cartel. I'm not saying that is made the cartel stronger. But there's a lot of counterintuitive and sort of effects that we don't always realize are going to happen. And so I think if I could just highlight a few of those that are super central. I mean, the first is quite obvious. When you crack down on the drug trade, you make it more profitable, right? I mean, this is just obvious that the international drug trade is worth tens of billions of dollars a year. And, if it were all legal, it would still be a very valuable drug trade, but it would not be as valuable. So the very cracking down on something for which there's enormous demand and inelastic demand, people will pay any price for drugs, makes it more profitable. And that's an economics 101 finding, but it's important to bear in mind. Another thing we already talked about, when you start to police retail drug trafficking in the periphery, right, in slums, you give the gangs who run that retail drug trade incentives to govern around the points of sale, because it makes it safer, because they can win the loyalty of people. So the very fact that the state is trying to police those areas is giving gangs incentives to govern. And, otherwise they would not have any reason to govern civilians. That wouldn't make sense for them. They wouldn't waste their time doing that. Another mechanism we haven't talked about yet is mass incarceration. And mass incarceration has a lot of effects on gangs, sort of ways that in which mass incarceration can strengthen the gang or strengthen gangs. But I'll just highlight, two. One is just by creating, many of these gangs were born in overcrowded, violent prisons, because they're, just for self-survival, they kind of banded together in these places where there was, rampant violence, often sexual violence, theft, there's predation. And so some of these gangs like the Comando Vermelho and PCC are born in prison, often in response to not only inmate-on-inmate violence, but really abusive state violence against inmates, prison massacres and things like that. So that's a main way in which these gangs get started. Once they get started, there's another really critical mechanism, which is incarceration rates. If these gangs are kind of controlling the prison, right, which is often the case, they start to govern in the prison. And the state's like, all right, you want to govern in the prison? Great. Now there's no more violence because there's this gang that's kind of, running the prison. And so sure, go ahead, run the prison. It's one thing less for me to do, right? But then anybody on the street is going to get sent to that prison, knows that the gang is in charge, and has reason to obey the gang even before they go to prison, right? Because, okay, if I ever go to prison, I'm going to be in a PCC prison. And so I want to make sure that I'm in good with the PCC. Well, if the PCC tells me, sends out a message to everybody, okay, we want you to do XYZ, maybe I'll do XYZ, because then they're going to know. And when I eventually go to prison, I'm going to be I'll be in better, I'll have to answer for my behavior on the street when I go to prison. Now, how likely am I going to go to prison? Well, if the incarceration rate is low, I'm not very likely. But if you have these gang sweeps, right, just locking up everybody who even looks like a gang member, then even if I look like a gang, even if I'm not a gang member, I just look like a gang member, well, I better obey the gang because I'm going to get swept up. I'm going to go to prison, right? And so these mechanisms, these mass incarceration kind of gang sweep mechanisms where you're taking lots of people from all over the city, right, from all over the country, and you're bringing them physically to places where the gang has power, you're helping that gang extend its power outward. And I think this mechanism is just very clearly on display in that not only with the expansion in Brazil, where the entire criminal underworld is organized from prison, but also in the cases of the Maras in Central America. The Maras in El Salvador, grew strong during Mano Dura and Super Mano Dura, which included gang sweeps that, would go and take thousands of kids off the street and put them in prison. And many of them turned out to not even be gang members. But once they got to prison and they were enjoying the protection of, whatever Mara they were put in, if you're from a Barrio des Ocho neighborhood, they put you in a Barrio des Ocho prison. If you're from a Mara MS-13 neighborhood, they put you in an MS-13 prison. All of a sudden, you're getting socialized into the gang. You have a good chance of getting sent to that prison, so you're kind of starting to obey them anyway. This is how those MATA organizations were able to build kind of nationwide networks, in their case, extortion networks, and sophisticated sort of governance institutions starting in prison, but also on the outside, and then reaching out into all these different neighborhoods. So I think it's just a consensus that the MATA phenomenon that Bukele inherited grew strong through Mano Dura kind of crackdowns in the past, right? So I think when I say you have to step back not only conceptually across the whole of Latin America and understand that there's all these ways in which repression can strengthen gangs, but also very specifically in the case of El Salvador. That's how the gangs got strong in El Salvador. They got strong in part through mass incarceration. And El Salvador was, even before Bukele, like among the very most highest incarceration rates of any country. It was already very, very high incarceration country before Bukele's big crackdown. So when we're and another thing I'll say about El Salvador that I think often gets missed is that it became very, very violent around 2015, a kind of an open conflict between the state and the gangs. But very soon after, in 2016, the violence began to decline. And it began to decline because the gangs began to, between themselves, pact and understand that they could reduce violence, and they could then use that as a bargaining chip with the state, right? With different political parties, with different leaders, right? They could make deals that said, look, we're in control of violence here. We can keep violence coming down, but we want concessions from you. And so a series of different political parties and different political leaders from 2016 onward negotiated with the gangs different forms of benefits that they were able to give to the gangs in exchange for violence reduction. And those negotiations include Bukele, right? He negotiated with those gangs, both as mayor of San Salvador and as president in 2019. It's only in 2022 that he does this flip, right? That he flips over to this super extra hyper Mano Dura crackdown that is now called the Bukele model, right? So the Bukele, again, it's very important to contextualize it. The Bukele model is it starts in 2022. I mean, you can date things from prior. He already took a very hard line publicly with the Matas, but he was negotiating with them right up until 2022. And then he kind of breaks that negotiation, locks everybody up, incarceration rates double to levels unheard of, right? 1.6% of the population. He builds C code and so on and so forth. And then you get this kind of Bukele model where everyone says, oh, he ended violence, he broke the gangs, there's no more violence. But if you look at the trend line, most of the reduction in violence happens before that 2022 crackdown. It does continue to drop after that crackdown. Now, all of that is to say, what do we make of this Bukele model? Well, there's no doubt that if we're being intellectually honest, we have to say, okay, maybe there's a level of state repression beyond which the gangs just can't even function, right? Maybe there's a level of the state not only deploying armed force, but revoking civil rights, right? Revoking due process, where you're allowed to just literally seize anybody for as long as you want without accusing them of a crime, without letting them talk to lawyers, without letting them have any contact with their family, and without any idea when they'll ever be let out of prison, if they'll be let out of prison, right? Maybe there's a level of repression that is not gang strengthening, right? That in fact is, just the gangs can't operate. And I think that's something we all have to, as scholars, that we do have to be intellectually honest about. We have to admit that that's possible. At the same time, I think we have to be clear-eyed about a couple of things. First of all, these very specific ways in which that happened in El Salvador, right? After he had negotiated with the gangs, after he had kind of already had a couple of rounds of, okay, they're going to kill a couple of people, then we're going to put them back, and then we're going to go back to our pact, right? So it's not clear that you just come out of the gate locking up everybody that's going to work, right? He'd already in many ways sort of softened up the gangs. It's also not clear that that's really even true, right? We know some of these Mata leaders are in the US, and he's trying to get Trump to deport them because he doesn't want them to tell what they know. And so we don't really totally know what's going on. The data on homicide rates in El Salvador are no longer trustworthy. There's been very limited access for journalists and things like that. So we also don't totally know 100% what to believe. And then I think the ultimate thing we need to two more things we need to bear in mind. One is that we don't know what's going to happen. So these processes I described where there were crackdowns or gangs got locked up or there was some kind of crackdown and then they emerged stronger. Those processes take a long time. Over and over again, if you look at the history of the Matas or you look at the history of the Comando Vermelho or the PCC over and over again, it's like everyone thinks their gang has been shut down. We put in place all these new harsh measures. There's nothing, the gang's been totally neutralized. We haven't heard anything, haven't heard a peep from them, right? I mean, if you permit me a quick example, right? Just to convey maybe maybe the Bukele model is working, but just bear with me for a second and let's think about São Paulo in 2001. In 2001, the PCC launches a mega rebellion in 26 prisons, and it was the first time where authorities were forced to admit that this group existed. They'd kind of been denying that this group existed. They do this massive prison riot in 26 prisons, and suddenly they're on the TV and they put their statute all over the place, and so it makes a big scandal. Oh, this gang's been has now controls half the prisons in São Paulo. And in the intervening years, the state really cracked down. They did gang sweeps. They did all these new solitary confinement regimes. They transferred the leaders to other states to try to break up the gang. And you didn't hear about the PCC for like 3 or 4 years. And officials started saying, well, that worked. We did it. We broke them. We put them in solitary confinement. We put the cell phone blockers, whatever, And then all of a sudden in 2006, they launched the second rebellion that's much bigger. Now it's 100 prisons in Sao Paulo, and all these attacks on the street that brought the city to a standstill in May of 2006. So that was 5 years, right? 5 years during which everybody thought that the PCC had been neutralized and that this crackdown had really, dealt them a severe blow and blah, 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 blah. Not only did it not dealt them a severe blow, they had gotten much, much stronger in the interim. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in El Salvador. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying you would be stupid not to at least think that something like that could happen, right? That 10 years from, or from the beginning of his crackdown, some new, even more powerful organization arises, right? The Matas come together and form some new, or who knows, right? Again, I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying, if we're going to be intellectually honest and say maybe this Bukele crackdown did make the Matas go away, we also need to be intellectually honest and recognize the history of Mano Dura has had these gang strengthening effects, and those gang strengthening effects often occur under the waterline, right? You don't notice them right away. They're slow, they're difficult to detect, and 5-10 years later, suddenly there's this very powerful criminal organization that nobody was expecting. So I think we need to think about that as well. And the last thing I'll just say is, yeah, maybe it worked, right? Maybe if this was, again, a level of state repression that is so extreme that it's breaking the gangs and in some ways supplanting them in the urban peripheries of El Salvador. But we should also be very clear that was only possible by suspending the democratic rule of law. People are not, they have no habeas corpus, they have no right to remain silent, they have no right to non-incrimination. They're just being held. Many people are being held not just without trial, but they don't even know what they're accused of. They're just held and just being held. So it's totally possible that that an authoritarian crackdown, can if nothing else displace gangs. And the other piece that I think is critical to note there is if Bukele really does seem to have kind of, in terms of criminal governance, he does seem to have taken over those communities, and people in those communities do seem happy because they're now able to move around, and so in many ways I think Bukele did what the gangs in Brazil did earlier, which was sort of he stopped all this internecine violence where it used to be these invisible borders and people couldn't cross. Now they can cross, and they're loyal. People are happy. They're just like the gangs in Brazil, where like people in the favelas are like, oh well, the gang did something good for us. People in El Salvador are saying, okay, Bukele did something good for us. So I do think that is, that's real and possible. But again, he part of what made it possible for him to do that is being able to use the same kind of freedom from due process that the gangs have, right? He can use violence without legal limit or constraint, just the way that the gangs are able to do as well, which makes imposing order a lot easier.
Yeah. But, and also I think at the end of it, gangs are nothing if not flexible and resourceful as well. I mean, okay, you sort of the whack-a-mole theory. Okay, well, let's crack down on this side of it. They'll pop up doing another thing. I mean, look at the Tren de Aragua. Really, it's almost like a criminal enterprise of sort of franchising different illicit activities. It's just where they're very clever and they go where the money is in terms of this. So I wonder how you sort of stop that. But I'm curious though. I'm curious, and we have to raise it. Is where's this gray area when we talk about criminal organizations, but then sort of official, legitimate criminal, I would not say legitimate state actors within criminality. So the corruption of the police, where does this fit into all of these different equations that we've discussed? Because there is a fear in I would say most communities in this part of the world that the police also have a certain degree of corruption, and well, that is criminal, of course.
Sure. And it's a huge issue, obviously, and it's also, we don't have, I would say there's a lot of variation in how high up corruption goes, right? And so you sort of have places where it's a local police battalion or it's a local police, who in some kind of collusion. You have places where the police aren't really the gangs are, they're just getting a small bribe and kind of looking the other way. You have places where the police are more involved in it. In Argentina, there's this whole sort of line of research on how the police actually in many ways sort of structure the drug trade, right? They have a more active role in making partnerships with local and they've been kind of given that job by the political system. Just make sure that the local drug trade is not violent and you kind of manage it and you can take whatever cut of the profits you want. So then you have like the old Mexican system back in the day under the PRI, where they at the national level were kind of, these sort of state-sponsored protection rackets where the corruption goes all the way to the very top. And I think you have a lot of variation in how corruption works. But I think there's an important point to be made here that's often missed. And it's one of the claims I make in my book. And, I think it'll in some ways be controversial. When we're talking about drug trafficking, right? And I think there's some other criminal activities as well. Obviously, corruption is a huge issue, right? There's a lot of money there, and every time you send a police officer to go, seize a bunch of cocaine, and if he's got the cocaine right there and he can seize it, the drug trafficker has an incentive to give that police officer a huge bribe to let him keep the cocaine, right? So or whatever, and so the very fact that it's such a lucrative activity and you're sending cops out to destroy some of that value, it creates opportunities for corruption. I wouldn't deny that. But with respect to criminal governance, right, with respect to gangs governing inside of prisons or governing urban peripheries, right, governing civilians as part of this strategy to keep the state out, I think corruption is in some ways sort of orthogonal to that. It's not, it might be a part of it, but it's not really so central to the story. Gangs don't bribe officials to let them resolve disputes among neighbors, right? Gangs don't bribe officials to let them decide who's going to sleep where inside of a prison cell, right? They don't have to bribe officials. The fact that the gang takes care of property crime inside the favela, the cops are like, great, do it. We'll be out here waiting on the outside of the perimeter, you know? And there doesn't need to be a corrupt transaction around criminal governance precisely because it benefits both at the same time, right? If the gang keep making the favela a place where nobody's pickpocketing, you know, the police aren't going to go in and say, hey, you got to give me a share of there's no share of anything to demand. Now, they may still go in and demand a share from the drug trade, right? It happens all the time. But the whole point of providing the criminal governance is, well, the cops now have a little bit less power to extract a bribe because they know if they go in and try to bust the drug traffickers can hide in the houses of the civilians because they've won the loyalty of the civilians. So it's not clear that the criminal governance is increasing corruption, and in some ways, it's making corruption a little bit on the margins, maybe a little bit more difficult. So I think that's an important point. I think I'm not trying to say corruption doesn't happen or it doesn't have an important role, but there's this sort of sense of like, oh, if the gangs are governing in the slums, it must be because the state is corrupt. And I think that's a little bit of a misreading. I think that the state is benefiting from criminal governance, but not necessarily in a corrupt way. It's benefiting because it doesn't have to do the job itself. And I don't think that depends on, you know, it might involve bribes, but I don't think it critically depends on bribes in the same way where if you're just strictly looking at the drug trade, you know, then you're really talking about corruption as a pretty important factor.
I think we need to wind this down a bit, and we've been tapping your profound knowledge on the subject. If you were, again, in a perfect world, everything was working as you expect it to work, what would be your recommendations for not combating or sort of minimizing organized crime within Latin America? I realize it's a huge question, but I mean, would you just say it needs to be a greater access to basic human rights, education, health, potable water, things like that, democratic process, fair elections? What would you say that would be something to let's draw Latin America as a whole out of this stigma of being a place where 1 in 9 live in some kind of criminal governance?
Sure. Well, again, I think, you know, there's organized crime, there's drug trafficking, there's other criminal activities like human trafficking, and then there's criminal governance, right? And these are related phenomenon, but they're not the same thing. And so there's one thing isn't going to solve all those problems at once. I do think that, and again, if you look at the cases of El Salvador, where there was a lot of criminal, or the rest of Central America, the Maras, there was a lot of criminal governance, and it wasn't particularly about drug retailing, right? So criminal governance can also be a story of extortion, and when it isn't a story of extortion, it's in some ways even more perverse, because now you've got poor people, you know, living in marginalized or peripheral communities. They're already on the outs. They're already not, you know, in many ways being neglected. And now they have to also pay extortion to some local, you know, gang. I mean, it's pretty bad. So, but I do think that, you know, moves towards legalizing drugs are, you know, let me put it the other way, because I don't think drugs are going to get legalized anytime soon. Not cocaine, not trafficking cocaine, which is what's driving so much of this. But let me put it the other way. If you don't do that, you've got this, you know, just engine of not only criminal activity, but criminal governance. Not only, you know, international drug trafficking generating billions and billions of dollars and funding and corrupting high-level officials and all that stuff, but you've also got low-level retail markets, and that's driving these processes of bottom-up crime and criminal governance throughout the hemisphere. And giving them incentives to do that kind of criminal governance, and giving them resources to do that kind of criminal governance. So as long as illicit drugs and popular illicit drugs with inelastic demand, especially cocaine, are illegal, and there's repression, there's a drug war. I think that this process of, I think criminal governance will continue to grow.
Mm.
I do think that if you want to target criminal governance, if you want to reduce criminal governance, I think there's evidence that it can be done. It's just, in my view, very expensive. So we look at the UPP pacification program that happened in Rio around 2008. That was a very rare program that explicitly said, look, we're not going to try to end the drug trade per se. We're not going to try to eliminate every criminal organization, but we are going to establish something like what we would call a Weberian monopoly, right? A monopoly on the legitimate use of force. We're going to come into these neighborhoods, occupy these neighborhoods, and we're going to tell the traffickers, look, if you're selling drugs, whatever, we're not going to, we catch you selling drugs, we're still going to bust you. But our priority isn't to stop every single drug trade. Our priority is you're not going to be walking around patrolling anymore with machine guns. We are going to be walking around patrolling. We're going to have the territorial control here. And this, that's just how it is. The state's going to govern here, and you guys can do your whatever criminal activity, just like in the US, where you see, sure, there's street corner gangs selling drugs, but they're not governing civilians. And that program, although, as it was rolling out and being kind of tweaked and experimented with in the first few favelas that they occupied, it worked. The gangs adapted, and they were, all right, well, we'll sell drugs out of little backpacks, and we won't have territorial control. We'll hide from the cops, and the cops will be the local governing authority. And, it worked so well that they rapidly expanded it to, hundreds of favelas, because the World Cup was coming and the games, Olympic Games were coming. And then the program kind of bogged down. They ran out of money. They didn't have enough of these specialized police. So they started using regular police. Then there was an economic recession. People disagree about why that program failed. But in my view, it didn't fail because the state was unable to establish something like, a Weberian monopoly on the use of force. It did. I think it failed because that proved to be very expensive, especially when you tried to replicate it out, not just 4 communities, but 200 communities,
Sure.
And so to me, that proves my point, which is you have, in a place like Rio, you have the illicit retail drug trade funding the governance of an urban periphery where millions of people live. The state is getting let off the hook for providing governance for millions of people, and that governance is being paid for out of the illicit drug trade, and it's being carried out by criminal organizations. So until something in that equation changes, you're not going to really make progress on criminal governance. There's going to be a huge fiscal gap if the state tries to take it all on by itself. It probably won't do as good of a job as the gangs. And so, for that very reason, there's no silver bullet. I can't say like, oh yeah, the state should just take over everything. It's not at all clear. Even Bukele has fiscal issues. I mean, he's constantly talking about how he doesn't have enough money to maintain Sico prison. And he's constantly, he's gone out for IMF loans. So even Bukele, who did maybe successfully monopolize, faces these fiscal constraints. So I think it's a real issue it's not something that's going to be fixed in the short run, but and in a sense, there's an underlying political issue, which is like, why were these areas allowed to be dominated by gangs in the first place? Well, because they're marginalized, they're poor, they're people who aren't really hooked into the political system, don't have political influence. You don't see criminal governance in the wealthy areas, right? You don't see gangs ruling over, Brazilian Wall Street or, in El Poblado in Medellin. You don't, the gangs rule other neighborhoods. And so that's partly because those rich neighborhoods have more money and they have more resources, but it's also really kind of a political question. It's because if gangs tried to rule there, those people have access to politicians who would make, everybody knows that wouldn't fly. And so in a certain sense, I've come to believe this criminal governance occurs in places where there's, for one reason or another, people sort of think, well, yeah, different rules apply in those neighborhoods. Those are poor neighborhoods, those are favelas. And until that changes, until that political question changes, right, where it's like, no, this isn't okay anywhere. right? And we're going to do whatever it takes. And the state's going to have to make transfers, and maybe we're going to have to cut some resources in the wealthier areas to bring those resources. It's a mass. It would be a, you know, it would be a massive redistribution over time. And so for that very reason, I think we're talking about very slow processes. If it took 20 or 30 years to build criminal governance in these places, then it's going to take that long to kind of wind it down. And that's going to be very hard to do because you're going to need constant political pressure to do so. So I'm a bit of a pessimist on this changing anytime soon. And I think if you actually look at some of these cases like Sao Paulo or Medellin, it's not, it's not even on the table to reduce criminal governance. On the contrary, right? What people, people are, no one's saying in Sao Paulo, let's retake control over the urban periphery from the PCC. The PCC is doing a great job. Who would want to step in and contest their authority where if they've reduced violence so much? So yeah, I don't see in the short run, I don't see that. I think the capacity's there, but I just don't see the political will or the fiscal resources.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to bring this to a close. Let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Benjamin Lessing, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Do keep an eye out for his book in 2026, Criminal Leviathan, How Gangs Govern from Behind Bars. I will certainly be purchasing a copy because obviously living down here and being involved and having lived in many of the regions mentioned, I'm fascinated by it all. So Benjamin, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you.
This has been the Latin News Podcast. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. As I said, we've been talking to Benjamin Lessing, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. We will be back in a fortnight discussing further issues and topics of interest from the region. Thank you again for listening, and please share and subscribe to the podcast. Goodbye.